All right, everybody, on today's show, we are being joined by a comedian, a fellow podcaster, and a wrestling superfan. His podcast, Wrestling with Depression, is helping to bring awareness to depression and other mental illnesses. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us welcome Mr. Marty DeRosa. Marty, thanks so much for joining us today. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on the program. That was a very nice description of the podcast. That was fantastic.
Oh,
you
no.
should be on all the shows that I do.
Oh, thank you. Now, I really want to get into this. It's a awesome thing, and we obviously just mentioned wrestling with depression. What inspired you to create a podcast about such a serious subject?
I wanted to do the podcast for a while. I've done, like you said, done a million podcasts. I've been on a million podcasts, and a lot of the times there was no real focus to the podcast. And I'm a big fan of podcasts that sort of have a focus, that have sort of a structure. And it's something that, mental illness, depression, something I've dealt with my whole life. And I had a lot of fellow stand-up comedians who also deal with it. And we would talk about it a lot. And it would always be kind of entertaining talks. And I just wanted to sort of find a way to sort of channel that and give it some focus and, make it a podcast and let people out there see that they're not the only people with depression. And, if I can slip in some wrestling references, or we have some fun episodes where I'll have some wrestlers on, it's perfect.
Mental health has become a huge topic of discussion as of late. What do you think could be done better here in the U.S. to help many people who suffer from mental illness?
I think that better health care, better services for, if people need to see somebody. It's too hard sometimes, especially if you are, very depressed. There have been times where I've been trying to find a therapist in my area, and I've had trouble. And when you're not feeling great, the last thing you want to do is hear somebody say, "Oh, I'm not taking new patients," or, "What kind of insurance do you have?" "No, I don't take that insurance." Or, "Oh, you don't have insurance." So I think they need to make it way more accessible. I think they need to have organizations. There's a great organization, NAMI.org, NAMI.org, who's an awesome resource to help find somebody in your area to talk to. But I think it just needs to be more. I think it needs to be just way more, as many, stamps.com commercials or audible.com commercials you have on podcasts. Like, there should be that many, like, hey, if you're not feeling right, if you need someone to talk to, there's these outlets to talk to somebody. So I think there needs to be definitely more awareness in that, and less of a stigma, less people feeling weird about going to a therapist or talking to somebody or trying medication.
Now, I was just going to bring that up. Back in, I say back in the day, I'm only 31, but back in the day whenever they, like cancer was just really being talked about, it was kind of a taboo subject. A lot of people, if you got it, you didn't tell people, or, a family member had it, you didn't really say much. And I feel like, you kind of just touched on that, but mental illness and awareness about these things, I feel like that's kind of the new way that this is happening. And people don't talk about it until it's too late. So I definitely commend you on what you're doing, and I definitely appreciate it. So
Thank you, man. That's very cool. No, I appreciate it, and that's the thing. Any stigma that's attached to it, the more people talk about it, and honestly, the more if I have guests on who are funny and we can have an entertaining conversation about it, and people, maybe they don't deal with OCD or bipolar disorder, but they can hear other people talk about it, and they've learned something. So if they know somebody in their life who is suffering from it, they have they have just that much more. Sort of a presence of mind of how to deal with this or how to talk to somebody about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you're obviously a jack of all trades. We mentioned a few of the many things that you do in the intro, but a lot of people probably know you from your stand-up. Now, when did this all start taking place? When did you decide that you wanted to start being a comedian?
I started doing stand-up about I would say about eight or 9 years ago in Chicago. And Chicago has a great comedy scene. So I would just go to shows and watch. And it was one of those things where I finally was just like, I think I can do this. I overthought it way too long. I waited too long to get started, and then finally got started, figured out some things, and then just it was kind of no looking back from there.
Who would you consider some of your comedy heroes?
Growing up, I loved like dirty comics. I loved like Andrew Dice Clay or Eddie Murphy. And pretty much, it's like wrestling. I would watch any comedian I would see on TV, just like I'd watch any wrestling. I wouldn't be like, oh, I don't like this, I'm turning the channel. If it was comedy or if it was wrestling, I watched it. So anybody, that was on Comedy Central, anybody that was on any of the late night shows, I would watch everybody, even the bad. That's why I love bad wrestling too. And like you can learn as much from watching bad comedy as good comedy. And I can watch a bad comedian special on Netflix and get maybe it's a twisted enjoyment out of it, but just as much enjoyment sometimes out of watching like a Patrice O'Neal or a Bill Burr special.
Absolutely. Now, as far as comedy goes, what are some of your goals? I guess we are a wrestling podcast, so I have to talk about this a little bit. So, as far as your WrestleMania moment in the world of comedy, what would that be for you?
I am just trying to get into the NXT of comedy right now. Wrestling and comedy are very similar. I'm at the point right now where comedy is my full-time job, just like somebody on the indies who's finally decided, like, you know what, wrestling is my full-time job. I'm trying to pay my rent with comedy, with acting, and that's the goal right now. And then, kind of everything else is just sort of icing on the cake. Obviously, you'd like to be on TV. You'd like to do a Comedy Central special, all those things. But right now, the goal is just, paying my rent with comedy. And like I said, it's the same thing as an indie worker out there who's trying to pay the rent through wrestling.
Any place you want to perform that you haven't gotten the chance to yet?
I think the Comedy Cellar in New York, that's one of those places that everybody talks about as an amazing place. And there are those places that wrestlers all talk about. They love to wrestle at. And for comedians, there's a place in Madison, Wisconsin called the Comedy Club on State Street. I was just there, and it's just one of those places where you're just like, wow, this is amazing, and you get spoiled there, and you wish every show was that good.
Okay, so now we mentioned it. We've been tiptoeing around it. I've got to, ask some more wrestling stuff. But you've picked up quite the following as of late with your adventures in pro wrestling. Have you always been a wrestling fan?
Always, as far as I can remember. Whether it was I remember getting like G.I. Joes or like the toys that my older brother had or whatever, and then they became mine. I was never concerned with like playing war with them. It was always, everything was a wrestler. Everything was wrestling related. If you were my friend growing up, you were into wrestling. Like we were watching pay-per-views. We were, wrestling in the backyard. It was always about wrestling.
That's awesome. Now, who were your favorites growing up? Being from Chicago in the Midwest, there was some awesome wrestlers coming through there. Who were some of your favorites?
Yeah, we got everything. We got WWF. We got, NWA, which became WCW. We got World Class. I loved World Class as a little kid. That was one of my absolute favorites. I thought the Von Erichs were the coolest. I'm like on ESPN. After school, I'd come home and watch World Class. And I was more of like an NWA kid growing up. Like I loved, if you had face paint, you were my guys. I loved the Road Warriors. I loved Sting. I loved Muta. And I grew up hating Ric Flair, and then I became I learned to appreciate Ric Flair. So the Horsemen and all those guys, Midnight Express, any of those. Like I just loved the tag teams too in that era. So those were the ones growing up.
We have seen a boom in the underground independent wrestling culture as of late. Why do you think people are looking for alternatives to the bigger companies?
Well, if you watch a 3-hour Nitro, a 3-hour Raw, it feels like a 3-hour Nitro now.
Yeah.
But if you watch a 3-hour Raw, you're just like, wow, this is not fun. But then you can go to an indie show, and they're so much fun. I've been spoiled everywhere I've lived. I was in Los Angeles for a little while, so we had like PWG. Here in Chicago, we have AAW. It's just a good indie show is amazing because you're seeing the next guys, and it's one of those things where the people who are the biggest stars now. Where I grew up in Northwest Indiana, we had one show. There was Punk, Cabana, Daniel Bryan, AJ Styles, Samoa Joe. Like the list goes on, and I can remember seeing. The newer guys come along. Oh, who's this Roderick Strong guy, or who's, these guys. So you kind of see the next evolution in wrestling, but also you just see these amazing matches, and you're so up close, and it's so personal. And I think for me, it's the same thing as seeing a great comedian in a smaller comedy club versus seeing somebody at Madison Square Garden. It's just way more fun when it's sort of in that intimate setting.
Awesome. Now you've partnered with one of pro wrestling's fan favorites, Colt Cabana, on numerous different projects. How did this pairing kind of come about?
Just through comedy. He was a big fan of stand-up comedy. Got released from the WWE, so he was back in Chicago, and we sort of just started trading Facebook messages back and forth, and then met up, and we started with $5 Wrestling, and then we did Creative as Nothing For You, and then we did Worst Promo Ever. We're always doing audio tracks for wrestling movies. I think we just released one for The Chaperone. And we do live shows, which are the most fun. For me, the live shows are the best. We do them every year at like WrestleCon. We do them in Chicago here. We're going to have a big one the night before Thanksgiving if you live in Chicago. And it's just a room full of wrestling fans joking about wrestling and getting all the references, getting the Scott Steiner references, getting the Randy Savage references. It's the greatest thing for me.
Do you feel like that pro wrestling fans are kind of they have to know that wrestling kind of lends itself to being mocked? So do you think that they appreciate having their own kind of wrestling comedian?
I think so. I mean, I think there's those times where, like on Twitter, which is my favorite thing to do, is just to tweet about wrestling. And it's funny, we're like a comedy club. If they're promoting you or something, they'll look on your Twitter, your Facebook page, and I'll show up for shows a lot of times. They're just like, "Boy, you really like wrestling, huh?" So there's just all these tweets about wrestling, especially during Raw or during a pay-per-view. But to me, it's like, when you have a perfectly crafted wrestling joke and it gets a bunch of retweets or a bunch of favorites, yeah, you can tell that wrestling fans, they appreciate sort of the comedic aspects of wrestling. And like you said, it's like wrestling fans, I think they're smart enough to know this is a ridiculous thing that we're all into, but it's amazing and it's awesome at the same time. And there's just things that happen in wrestling, whether it's certain wrestlers who just can't help but put their foot in their mouths, or just situations or angles that we as fans are just like, come on, this is ridiculous, and you sort of have to make jokes about it.
To get back to your podcast briefly, do you feel that comedians and wrestlers are a similar breed of people, and do you think that there are some correlations with both jobs and depression?
Yeah, I do, actually. I mean, anytime that I run a show in Chicago called Comedians You Should Know, and a lot of times if wrestlers are passing through, they'll come to the show, they'll come hang out, and even if a comedian isn't a wrestling fan, but we're all hanging out after the show, the connection is there, the bond is there, there's the frame of reference is there. So everybody instantly has something to talk about. And one of the things with comedy, and it's the same thing with wrestling, it's the same thing with acting or people getting into music, the quote unquote, normal person who just is everything's fine and everything's good. A lot of times they don't get into these fields because the people who do get into, a lot of forms of entertainment, there's something missing. There's a hole there or something, and they're trying to fill it up with that attention from crowds. And I think a lot of times if you talk to a lot of wrestlers or you talk to a lot of comedians, there's sort of a reason why they're doing it, and whether it's, family relationships or just the way they were raised or something like that. But a lot of times there's just sort of this feeling of sort of wanting more and sort of wanting that spotlight or attention.
Are there any new projects that you're working on that you can tell us about?
Well, I just relaunched Wrestling with Depression. I was not doing it for a little while because my depression was bad. So now I'm back doing that, and I'm back in Chicago. So now that Cabana and I are back in the same city, we're going to have some more projects coming up, and that's sort of the main focus right now is stand-up and the podcast. But there'll definitely be some more projects coming up.
Awesome. Now, social media is obviously the biggest thing in the world today. You mentioned you have Twitter. Can you tell us all like where people can find you and where they can find out about your comedy and Wrestling with Depression?
For sure. Wrestling with Depression is available on iTunes. I've got MartyDeRosa.com is the website that I'm trying to revamp right now. That's going to be eventually the destination for everything, and I'll have show dates and all that stuff. And at Marty DeRosa on Twitter. That's, like I said, that's my favorite thing, and I tweet out everything as far as shows and podcasts and all that other information. But more than that, just jokes about wrestling, which is my favorite thing to do on the planet.
Yeah, I was surprised getting on your Twitter. I forget. Oh, it was been a couple days or whatever, but there was your banners, the old Hasbro toys with the Undertaker. Yeah,
my favorites, Undertaker Ball. Yeah, no, but wrestling figures. That's another thing too. Growing up, that I was obsessed with.
Now, and, I have to say, I didn't realize until now that you are from. I guess you are a Hoosier at heart.
I am.
I'm from Southern Indiana, so I am a little bit different from you. But I did move. I'm out here on the East Coast now, and I'm just shocked. Chicago, I never went to, but it's Chicago gets a lot of wrestling shows. Indiana did not get a lot of wrestling shows, and now I'm completely spoiled being on the East Coast because there's one every minute that you can go to. So.
Yeah, where I grew up in Cherville, Indiana, which is considered Northwest Indiana, which is basically a suburb of Chicago. We get the Chicago newspapers, Chicago television. You grew up liking the, Bears, Cubs, Blackhawks, all that stuff. So I've always sort of identified with Chicago, even more so than kind of, any team in Indianapolis or anything like that. But wrestling-wise, yeah, we got everybody in Chicago. And then for that run, that IWA Mid-South would be in Highland, Indiana all the time, and I always went. It was awesome shows.
That's great. So I have to ask before we wrap this up, is there anything else that you want to mention? I know. Could you give us the website again for you had mentioned it about if people are suffering from depression?
Yeah, NAMI, NAMI.org, and that's an amazing resource. That's how I found my therapist. They're good people. They get back to you right away, and they're going to make sure you find the help you need.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I have to ask you, being from Chicago, are the Cubs going to win the World Series?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, of course.
That's awesome. So thank you so much for coming on. Wonderful guest. Keep up all the great work, and we are looking forward to seeing what else you can come up with.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I appreciate it.